Good morning, everyone, or evening to those of you joining from down under, and welcome to today's webinar from the Institute of Export and International Trade about the new UK-Australia Free Trade Agreement, brought to you in partnership with the UK government. This is the first of two quick-fire webinars we're running this week on the UK's new trade agreements, with another session being run at the same time tomorrow about the UK's deal with New Zealand. My name is William Barnes-Gray, I'm the Executive Editor at the Institute, and I will be your host today. But on the next slide, you'll see we have two fantastic speakers today. Firstly, we're delighted to be joined again by Henrietta Giada, the Institute's lead on trade deals, who'll be giving an introduction to the UK's agreement with Australia and some of the Institute's support around it. We'll then be hearing from Conor McLaughlin, the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office's Lead Trade and Investment Officer for Australia. Conor will be giving an overview of the opportunities that the deal will create for UK-Australia trade, as well as the trade policy implications of the agreement. Indeed, Conor is joining us all the way from Australia, where it is early evening now, so we really do appreciate his being able to join us today. On the next slide, though, before we get going, we're going to run a quick poll to find out a little bit more about you, our audience. So this one is asking about your trade with Australia at present. The options being, we export to Australia, we have operations or subsidiaries established in Australia, we are planning to export to Australia, we are planning to set up those subsidiaries, or we have no plans to do business with Australia. And you can select all that apply in this case. While you are answering that poll, some quick housekeeping notes from me. Firstly, you can contact me with any comments or questions using the question panel on the control window, which is usually to the right-hand side of your screen. We hope to get to a number of your questions today, though please note we cannot guarantee we will get to every question in the allocated time. Please also note that if your questions are short and clear, I'm far more likely to be able to read them, so please do try to avoid long paragraphs when sending in your questions. Finally, you will receive a recording of the webinar as well as a copy of the slides in a follow-up email we will be sending over the next day or so. So thank you everyone for answering that poll. I'm just going to close it now. And really interesting that 2/3 of you are already exporting to Australia. So hopefully this webinar will really help to educate you about how the trade deal can enhance your exports to Australia. And for the just under a quarter of you planning to export to Australia, hopefully this webinar will accelerate those plans too. 10% of you saying you have operations or subsidiaries established in Australia, 4% of you say you're planning to have that, and a tenth of you have no plans to do business with Australia at the moment. Maybe this webinar will convince you otherwise. But on the next slide, without any further ado, it is my delight to hand over to Henrietta to begin today's webinar. Over to you, Henrietta.
Thank you, Will, and hello everyone, and thank you for joining our webinar today to have a look at the UK-Australia Free Trade Agreement and how it can benefit businesses trading with Australia. My name is Henriette Gjerde. I'm a trade and customs specialist here at the Institute of Export and International Trade, where I lead our work on trade agreements and services. So if I can have the next slide. So for the agenda today, we of course already had an introduction from Will. We will have a look at the importance of the trade agreement and the available support from us at the IOE&IT. We are lucky to have Conor McLaughlin with us today from the UK government, who has expert knowledge on both the free trade agreement and the markets in question, to go through the benefits of trading with Australia and the opportunities the agreement leads to, as well as talk about the policy implication. Finally, we'll be answering some of your questions before wrapping up this session today. So if I can have the next slide. So before I hand over to Conor, who will give you a more detailed overview of the benefits and opportunities, I wanted to quickly cover some of the key benefits of the agreement to highlight the importance of it. So as we know, trade agreements can be complicated to read and fully understand. It's full of legal text, and the text of the agreement usually covers thousands of pages. A trade agreement's aim is to make it easier for businesses from different markets to trade with each other, strengthen cooperation, and for countries to build closer economic ties, which is why today we wanted to break it down and introduce some of the main benefits and opportunities this trade agreement can bring for businesses. So the agreement was signed in December 2021 and will soon enter into force, meaning that we'll see some key benefits for UK businesses wanting to export to or import from Australia. And to mention a few, these are, as you can see here on the slide, increased trade. So the agreement will reduce and eliminate tariffs on a wide range of goods, such as cars, Scotch whisky, chocolate, and this can help make UK products more competitive on the Australian market and help boost trade between the two countries. Additionally, with the more flexible rules of origin, UK businesses will be able to use some imported parts and ingredients and still qualify for the zero tariffs when exporting to Australia. We'll see improved market access. So the agreement will provide improved market access for businesses in both countries, making it easier for you to sell goods and services in each other's markets. So examples of some sectors benefiting from this is financial services, technology, advanced manufacturing, and many more. We'll see enhanced cooperation. So the agreement will strengthen the relationship between the UK and Australia and create opportunities for greater cooperation in areas such as science, technology, education. We'll see economic growth. The agreement is expected to contribute to economic growth in both countries as businesses benefit from increased trade and improved market access. There will also be new opportunities for UK businesses to invest in Australia, especially in areas such as infrastructure, energy, technology. We'll see strategic benefits. So the agreement will also have some strategic benefits for both countries, as it will help deepen their relationship in the Asia-Pacific region and enhance their position in the global economy. So with this FTA, the free trade agreement, UK and Australia has also made commitments to collaborate on environmental issues, gender and labor rights, as well as included dedicated chapters for support for small and medium enterprises, innovation, and digital trade. So overall, this agreement is an important development for both countries. It signals their commitment to free and open trade and their desire to deepen their economic ties, which again leads to better opportunities and more benefits for businesses in both countries. So if I can have the next slide. So here at the IOE&IT, we want to ensure that everyone is aware of the support that we offer for anyone who is either already involved in international trade or anyone who is interested in getting involved and looking to learn more. Therefore, I've added a short list here of some of the support services we offer for our members. So anyone interested should feel free to reach out to us if you have any questions or if you want to learn more about this. But our offerings includes training and qualifications, direct support from a large team of consultants and specialists. We have a dedicated help desk for support. We host webinars and lunchtime learnings. We have networking events, and we also have a daily bulletin and newsletter with the latest news and expert articles. So in this webinar, we'll dive deeper into the importance of the UK-Australia Free Trade Agreements and the potential impact on both countries. So that's all I have for you today. So with this in mind, I'm happy to hand over to our next speaker, Connor.
Alrighty, fantastic. Well, thank you, Henrietta. So obviously, as mentioned, my name is Connor. I'm with the UK government based here in Australia, and my primary role is essentially the middleman between policy or government and businesses. So taking 2,000 pages of legal text and making it applicable for businesses to utilise the benefits of the FTA. So what I'm going to do today is just provide a brief Australian market overview. So discussions about what's happening in the Australian economy and how the UK ecosystem can synchronise with those changes. And then I'll follow on with obviously the UK-Australia Free Trade Agreement and then the benefits and the policy decisions that implicate that. So if we can go into the next slide. So the way that to think about the Australian economy is that there was obviously a disruption during COVID, but the undercurrent of Australia's economy has always been the fact that it's an export-oriented economy. And obviously with COVID, coupled with sort of the end of its 26-year-long uninterrupted economic growth, the Australian government has realised that it needs to diversify, and that's become a key buzzword here in Australia, away from East Asia towards like-minded partners such as the United States and the UK. both in an outbound and an inbound context. So one way to think about Australia is obviously it offers British businesses a wealthy, sophisticated market with a very transparent and open business environment. There's very few barriers to entering Australia. Obviously, it's got familiar legal and corporate systems, as well as business culture. And then it's consistently ranked within the top 10 of business friendliness, honesty, and integrity. And with all those features generally offsetting the small market size. And the way that I always like to think about Australia going into the future, particularly within a post-FTA environment, is the fact that Australia can be a launchpad to the Asia-Pacific region, particularly with the UK signing up to the CPTPP. The attitude towards the UK and Australia is very positive at the moment, obviously with that diversification in mind. So the UK is Australia's second largest source of foreign investment. So that could be direct investment from the financial sector, as well as UK companies exporting or setting up in Australia. And obviously this consists of 18% of Australia's total. So the UK is firmly embedded within the country. And then looking from a UK government point of view, Australia is obviously seen as the second export growth potential, only behind Switzerland. So there's a lot of potential within the Australian market. So we can go into the next slide. Okay, so essentially, obviously the UK is embedded within the Australian market, and there's 6 sort of key priority sectors within the services side as well as the export side. As seen on the screen, we're looking at pharmaceutical and medical goods, so such as life sciences. We're looking at consumer goods with automotive, specialized machinery, and general scientific equipment. But then it seems to be that on the services side, this is where the real potential lies. So we're looking at legal services, financial services, professional business services. So you look at the big 4 corporate firms. Transportation seems to be a big one because there's a lot of interest within Australia about decarbonising its transport system, as well as general other business services. So we can pop on to the next slide. Okay, so where does the UK sort of ecosystem sort of synchronise with the way that Australia is going? So obviously the UK sectors that will see the biggest benefit from the agreement is the traditional ones, so agriculture, food and drink. We're looking at e-commerce and consumer goods, transportation, as well as the services sector. But how does this harmonise with UK government priorities? So the UK government is prioritising things like financial services and fintech, technology, e-commerce, smart cities, and cybersecurity. So those sexy buzzwords that is becoming the future of the economy. And the way that I've always looked at the FTA is, we can talk about tariffs and taxes, but what this FTA really tries to do is sort of future-proof the economy to sort of make the Australian economy and the British economy more interoperable between the two within those key sectors. Alrighty, next slide. Alrighty, so where are we at the moment? So we've just achieved royal assent on March 24th. So we are still waiting on an entry into force date, but we should get an entry into force deal signed and done. So the next slide. Alrighty, so the benefits for good exporters. So obviously, we can talk about tariffs all day long. So about 99% of tariffs will be removed upon entry into force. There are a couple of niggly things such as beef, cheese, and steel, which obviously has a transition period to protect local industries. So some of it's 5-year, 10-year, and 15 years. There's also a changing to the rules of origin agreement. So that makes it more simplified. And one of the key aspects of Australia is because Australia has a free trade agreement with China, a lot of British companies who either import a lot of commodities from China to produce a product won't have to change their supply chains in order to qualify for that 0% tariff exemption. And then other things that are brought up about the deal are the provisions to consult on any specific trade concerns. So both the Australian government and the UK government are prioritising commitments to establishing a website for SMEs who might have questions about technical barriers, who have questions about HS codes and how do they actually utilise. Because I think one of the things that I've noticed within both a British and an Australian context is that the FTA is not automatic, so you can't just, so once it comes in entry into force, it doesn't become an automatic sort of embedded feature within trade and investment. You have to utilise it and you have to tell Customs and Border Patrol, both here in Australia and in New Zealand, that you are utilising the FTA to qualify for that exemption. So if we can pop on to the next slide. Alrighty, so services is probably the sector where we're seeing the most benefit. Perhaps the biggest one is improved access to trade and services. So the Australian UK FTA, Australia is allowing the greatest access to the Australian market for any country that it's ever agreed to, bar New Zealand, because that's quite a special relationship. Another thing that we're looking at is, so we're looking at Maritime Services Index and Express Delivery Services. So the Australian Government and Australian Border Patrol has agreed to release goods, non-perishable goods within a 6-hour time frame, as well as perishable goods within a 6-hour time frame, as well as non-perishable within a 48-hour time frame. So that's a legally guaranteed commitment. And then we're also looking at services sectors such as professional services, so legal services, financial services. They will also have increased access to the Australian economy. They'll have access to Australian government procurement contracts, as well as the financial services sector, which establishes a precedent for setting a dialogue for regulatory cooperation. So things like, how do you set up in Australia? How do you set up a tax regime in Australia? And those niggly things that can be overlooked within the grand scheme of things or within your business journey will be sort of sorted out or synchronized within the free trade agreement. So next slide. Okay, so benefits for UK investors. So the way that we look at investment is in two frames. The first one is obviously financial, so a bank that's investing within a project in Australia. And the second one is sort of foreign direct investment, so a company that's either exporting to Australia or they want to set up shop in Australia. And so what the investment chapter does is it commits to strengthening the direct investment relationship. And this is probably a big one that Australia wants to harness, because the UK is obviously its second largest investment partner behind the United States. And perhaps the biggest change of all is that the Australian Foreign Investment Review Board, which is historically tricky and niggly to navigate, has agreed to give the UK favoured country status. So that means anything above $298 million, which is give or take about £110 million, won't need to go through a Foreign Investment Review Board, which typically takes about 6 to 8 months. The other thing that it does guarantee is that it prohibits certain performance requirements, as well as includes investment protections, which is obviously a big ask from businesses when we're doing the negotiation phase of the free trade agreement. Alrighty, next slide. Alrighty, so benefits for UK contractors. So within the procurement chapter, which is a massive one, it legally guarantees British companies will have access to both Australian federal government as well as Australian state and territory government procurement contracts. So what this does is it puts British companies on a legally recognised level playing field with Australian companies, and it proves that the Australian government doesn't have to prove that it can guarantee a contract from an Australian company before it offers a British company the same privilege. So there is a side letter within this chapter, and that essentially extends coverage to local government procurement contracts should Australia agree to this. So essentially what that means is if the local government cannot produce a contract from an Australian company, then it has the ability to go offshore, and the only countries that have that ability are New Zealand and the UK. So that's a big win for the UK market. So next slide. Alrighty, so if we get into some of the particular issues within the free trade agreement, moving beyond sort of the overarching or the niche issues, obviously from day one, 99% of goods and commodities will come in tax-free. And obviously this is going to save about $17 million within the grand scheme of things. But specifics, if we're looking at, say, food and drink, a lot of food and drink will be reduced from 5% to 0%. Within the automotive industry, we're looking at things like 5% for buses and shipping. And then within the UK fashion industry and e-commerce, we're looking at a 10% tariff reduction. And obviously within the current cost of living crisis, every dollar or pound helps that matter. So if we go into the next slide. So obviously, I think this is a really good illustration of where things are going. So obviously within the FTA from the get-go, we'll have free access to the Australian market. Obviously, again, you do have to specify within your sort of customs agreement to the Australian Border Force that you are utilising the deal to qualify for that exemption. And then one of the other things that we are working on is prioritising that sort of rules of origin component. So if you do import goods from another country and then manufacture it in the UK, in order to ship it to Australia, then we are working with Australian Border Force to sort of clarify those niggly things so that British businesses can benefit from the day dot. Alrighty, next slide. Alrighty, so speaking of customs, customs is probably one of the niche issues that everyone has an issue with. So it's extremely tedious and it's really hard to navigate, primarily because Australian Border Force has a million things to do at once. So obviously within a legally guaranteed frame, as I've stated before, they'll release all goods within a 48-hour period and all perishable goods within a 6-hour period. This includes fast-track deliveries. So we're working with companies such as DHL, FedEx, UPS, and the Australian Border Force to create sort of a regime to fast-track that. And Australian authorities have agreed to issue a ruling within 90 days for tariff classifications and rules of origin requirements. And this is on top of the previously agreed 180 days before the deal came into force. So we're halving the time frame. If there is an issue, then the Border Force will solve it within a 90-day period. The other thing that's probably a big one is that there is not a legally guaranteed need for customs brokers. A lot of the conversations that I've been having with businesses, they are still quite capable of utilising customs brokers because obviously perhaps they've established a relationship and it does synchronise that process to get through or to access the Australian market quicker. And then the other thing is obviously to make things easier for UK businesses exporting to Australia, both countries have agreed to promote an information accessible online transit procedures. So this is going to be on both the Australian Border Force website as well as the Home Office website, and this will promote ideas, information, statistics on border crossing procedures, documentation that you might need when you're thinking about exporting to Australia, when you already are exporting to Australia, and how the FTA will actually change under these procedures. And then obviously the operations hours. So the basic one is the fact that Australia, or at least where I am, is 8 hours ahead of the UK. In some cases, it can be up to 11 hours, depending on daylight savings. So those things can make a big difference within the grand scheme of things, but they are inherently overlooked. And then probably the last one is that both parties have agreed to implement a single trade window. So this is basically an online portal where all the information and all the paperwork can be uploaded to fast track that process to gain access into the market. Alrighty, next slide, please. Alrighty, so rules of origin. So this is probably one of the overlooked aspects of trade investment, and particularly within that sort of economic diversification portfolio. This is where Australia seems to be coming to the table a bit more now. So obviously within the FTA, it sets forth easier rules, clearer rules and simpler rules to determine whether a product between the UK or Australia is considered to be made within each country. So obviously with diverse supply chains, you might get product from East Asia or Africa or South America. It might be manufactured in the UK. So what's going to happen is that both countries are going to have a dedicated platform or portal that will obviously illustrate how to calculate a rules of origin and whether that would classify for the tariff exemption. So what this means is that British producers can continue to source some ingredients or components from other countries, as well as shipping the final product to Australia and qualifying for that tariff exemption. And then what that essentially means is that British businesses won't have to massively alter their existing supply chains to qualify for that tariff exemption. Alrighty, next slide. Alrighty, so probably the biggest issue or the biggest question that I often get is about mobility. So that's when can we bring in Aussies to the UK, or from Australian companies, it's when can we bring bits over. And what the FTA does is it enhances the UK's perception and enhances the UK's position within Australia to access the Australian market. So this is probably the largest agreement that Australia's ever granted, again, bar New Zealand. So if we just pop onto the next slide. So what the agreement does is that business visitors, so upon entry into force, business visitors can come for 3 months. This could simply be like a fact-finding mission to see if the country or the market is right for you. If you are a sales representative trying to sort of conclude a contract, you can come up between 6 months and 12 months. Installers and servicers, again, 3 months. And then if you're an intra-corporate transfer, independent executive, or a contractual service supplier, you can come up to for up to 4 years, which is up from the previous 2. And then as an additional caveat to that, if you're staying for more than 12 months, your partners and dependents are granted both right of entry, movement, and full employment rights. And then on to the next slide. And then if we're looking at, say, the working holiday visa, so that's typically the poster child of how people view mobility between Australia and the UK. So obviously that's been extended to 3 years from the previous 2, with no additional requirement to work on the bush, as well as the age range has been increased to 35, which is now considered young. And the caveat to that is that will come in within 2 years of entry to force. So the FCDO and DFAT will be discussing how that sort of integrates within the current system. Another one to consider is an Australian-only initiative, which is the Innovation in Early Career Skill Exchange. So what that essentially means is that it's inherently big by nature. So if you work in an industry such as cybersecurity, AI, robotics, or one of those new sexy areas, then you can qualify for a year of entry. You can qualify for a 1-year visa working in that sector. So this could be education, it could be business, or it could be within government, and this comes in within 1 year of entry to force. Alrighty, next slide.
Connor, just a quick heads up on time, because obviously we want to do some questions at the end. So if we could wrap up in the next minute or so, that'd be fantastic.
Easy, alrighty. So I can go on all day about specific issues. I know all 2,000 pages off by heart, which is probably not a good thing, but there's obviously additional chapters that can be included. So we're talking about environment, gender, innovation, SME, which are not traditionally looked at within the grand scheme of things of an FTA. But on the next couple of slides, there are some key information packs. I'm always happy to take questions, specific questions about, say, HS codes or rules of origin. So I believe my details will be sort of disseminated to all the participants. So if you've got a specific question about a specific issue, then I'm more than happy to help. But yeah, that's all good.
Great. Thank you, Connor. And we are going to be sharing the slide pack with everyone after the webinar, which will include these links, which will be actually more clickable in the PDF than on the webinar screen. And also on the last slide, there's the contact information as well. And I'll pop that in the chat in a moment. But on the next slide, just before we hand back to Connor, just to talk about the policy implications of the deal, we're going to run our second poll, just asking you what you think the main benefit of the deal is for your business. Options including reduced tariffs, easier travel, mutual recognition of qualifications, reduced bureaucracy, and other. Please feel free to type in what your other would be using the same facility as the questions. We are getting some really good questions coming through. We'll try to answer as many of them as we can. But this is, I think, a really good question from Julian, who asks, given the size of the Australian market, does it make sense to think about exporting to Australia as a single entity, or should British businesses be more targeted looking at specific regions or cities? Connor, do you want to answer that one?
Yeah, I can jump in. It's a really interesting question, because I think one of the sort of the undercurrents of Australia is that it's not very good at telling its story, particularly or coupled with the fact that people don't tend to understand Australia very well, and that's something that I've noticed from being here. And in particular, the fact that although people look at Australia as an overarching concept, we've also got the state-based organizations. So states inherently have different priorities, and what that can mean is that if you are within a particular sector or you're exporting to the Australian market, perhaps one state might be a better fit than the other. So for instance, if you're providing, say, a legal service or a professional service export to Australia, New South Wales, which is where Sydney's based, and Victoria, which is where Melbourne's based, are probably a better fit for you than, say, where I'm based in Perth in Western Australia. However, say someone who's producing a sort of an e-commerce or agri-food and drink, I always say that Western Australia, where I am, is probably a better fit, given the percentage of British people that are based here. And then you can use that as a platform to gauge interest within a product and then further expand over east. So, and I think the other thing to consider is that given the distance between the UK and Australia, given the distance between the UK and Australia, it's difficult to understand the local market. So if you can, I'm more than happy to provide sort of information on sort of how states view things, and then coupled with that idea is that obviously each state has their own incentive packages to attract imports to the state, which is probably unheard of within the sort of the international community. Coupled with the fact that there are a lot of sort of government contracts, government incentives, such as tax reductions or tax rebates that different states offer. So that's definitely something to consider when you're looking at Australia, is how each state views their own sort of strategic priorities within the economy and how that can synchronise with a UK business that's looking to export.
Great, terrific. Thank you, Connor. I think that's really good insight there. So it sounds like there's a state-by-state kind of approach can be quite beneficial, particularly with the localized support. Thank you everyone for providing, of answering the poll. This isn't actually too surprising in a way, because we've had quite a lot of goods exporters on our recent webinars. So I suspect this is reflective of the type of audiences we're getting on at the moment on the webinars. So 78% view saying reduced tariffs as a clear indication. I think that's a very significant benefit. But without further ado, I'll hand back to Connor on the next slide.
Alrighty, fantastic. So what I might do in terms of policy implications is sort of flow on from that poll. And obviously the number one concern was the fact that tariff reductions are probably the biggest issue, or the biggest benefit that the audience sees here. So obviously from the get-go, from entry into force, 99% of products coming into Australia will qualify for that zero tariff exemption. Obviously the caveats, so you look at steel, steel, cheese and beef are probably the three main sectors that won't qualify for a 0% initially. They'll take on a 5, 10 and 15-year sort of transition phase. So in terms of the policy implications of the FTA, there's not a lot that I haven't covered already, apart from the fact that the biggest thing policy-wise is actually to state that you're using the FTA, because one thing that we've had in the past, or Australia's had in the past, is that when they sign a free trade agreement with another country, then the other country sort of automatically exports to Australia, thinking that the 0% tariff qualification exists. And then what Australian Border Forces do is, okay, they haven't said that they're using an FTA, so slap a 5% or 10% or 15, sometimes even 50% tariff on it. The other things that are key of noting is that when you are exporting to Australia, although the FTA does provide some sort of incentive within a 5 or 10, 15% tariff reduction, there are sort of domestic considerations. So if you are exporting sort of goods products, particularly within the agriculture, food and drink products, there are sort of policy implications within the sort of sanitary. So Australia and New Zealand, sort of Asia Pacific more generally, are very strict when it comes to biosecurity. And this isn't only in an Australia context, this is also state by state based. So particularly if you're sort of exporting fruit, for instance, then WA has a completely different regime to New South Wales, which then has a different regime to Victoria. So it's not a harmonized process in any way, shape or form. So that's something to consider, coupled with the fact that another thing that the FTA does is geographical indicators. So what a lot of sort of British companies need to consider is, say if you're exporting red Leicester cheese, one of the things that the FTA considers is if you're not actually from Leicester, then there might be an issue in terms of qualifying for that tariff exemption. So these are sort of overlooked but important factors that Australia and the UK are sort of trying to synchronise in terms of getting the best deal. Other sort of policy implications are strategic dialogues. So there are a couple of dialogues that come out of the FTA. And the way that I've always viewed it is that this isn't a static document. So there is sort of a tendency within this FTA to say, in 7 years, we'll come back to the negotiating table and to see what has worked, what hasn't worked, and then based on that, we'll renegotiate the deal in and of itself. So one of the dialogues that are coming out of it is the innovation dialogue. And what that means is we're looking at each individual sector, so whether it's agri-food and drink, whether it's services, and how do we sort of utilize innovation to sort of promote sort of a streamlined approach in terms of getting access to the Australian market. So, if you are selling a product, what percentage of that is coming from e-commerce? And then if it is a low percentage, how do we utilize technologies to sort of enhance your presence within the Australian market? So that's one of them. Another one is sort of the recognition of professional qualifications, which I noticed wasn't a big issue within the poll, or the second poll. But that is obviously a big winner. And the way that we are thinking about this is that the free trade agreement can be used as a platform. Obviously, we've got 3 specific sectors right now, so it's architects, lawyers, and engineers. But if this is successful, then the UK government and the Australian government have had an appetite to expand that to other professional qualifications. And that's sort of the way that I've always thought about the free trade agreement, is that we can talk about tariffs and taxes and those types of things, but what it's actually all about is future-proofing the economy to say, if I work in a specific sector in the UK, or if I'm a UK business or exporter, it should be the easiest country to export to. And I think that's what the Australian government's trying to do with a lot of its new free trade agreements. And I think the UK has a lot of potential in sort of this post-Brexit world, where how do they define sort of a trade agreement? Coupled with the fact that I think on the last slide when I discussed, there's obviously different sectors that aren't traditionally looked upon within an FTA. So we look at the environment chapter. That's a massive one, considering the change of government here in Australia. We look at gender, so how do we sort of utilise trade as a platform to get more female participation, more female business owners, more female entrepreneurs. Innovation I mentioned, which is inherently vague, but I think that's the point of innovation. And then we also have an SME chapter, so that's probably one of the biggest ones, but it's perhaps one of the most overlooked in terms of what both governments are trying to do. Is they're going to establish a website that sort of provides all the information that any company would need to know in terms of whether you're exporting to Australia, whether you're setting up shop in Australia, or whether you're already based in Australia. How can you utilise the deal to expand your base of operations here, and then obviously to promote profitability. So I think that's really all I've got on policy. Again, I can go into detail about many different sectors and many different issues, and I'm more than happy to have a discussion post this webinar about specifics. But yeah.
Great, thank you, Connor. And well, I think that's really insightful. So it's really great to get that context as well as the detail you shared earlier as well. So thank you for that presentation, and also thank you for Henrietta for introducing the webinar earlier. We've got some decent time now for questions then. So I'm going to run another quick poll before we get into the main bulk of those questions. I'm just asking you what you think the main challenge of UK-Australia trade is for your business. Options there being tariffs, logistics and distance, market access, market knowledge, and other. Again, please feel free to say what your other means in the question box. Just a quick heads up on questions. We're getting some really good questions through. One caveat I'm going to say is that we're not going to go into product or kind of niche sector specific questions on this webinar, primarily because I think that'd be isolating for the rest of the audience. So please try to keep the questions relatively general if you can. And if you do have specific questions, I'll put Connor's contact details, his email in the chat. And you can also make use of the Institute's technical helpline for specific questions as well. But let's get into it. So we've had a really good question in from Barry, and he has asked, given the distance between the UK and Australia, how does the deal with Australia align with the UK government's green trade agenda? A nice juicy question, but Connor, do you want to start on that one?
Yeah, sure thing. So the environment chapter, or the green side of the FTA, is inherently vague from the get-go, but I think that was the purpose, and the main reason for that was sort of the previous Australian government sort of disregard for environmental issues. But then again, having said that, sort of the vagueness of the chapter or sort of the green initiative within the agreement has worked in its favour, because the new Australian government is very proactive in sort of stating its ambitions to, go to net zero, promote sustainability. And then what that does is, because Australia's playing catch up, there's a lot of potential for UK businesses to sort of exploit that catch up game. So obviously you've got the environment chapter, which talks about sort of the renewable energy sector. So how can Australia or the UK tap into sort of Australia's sort of wind prioritisation? I know a lot of both state and federal governments are trying to invest a lot within electric vehicles, so that's a big one within the automotive sector. But then it also looks at sort of overlooked things within the grand scheme of things when you're discussing the environment. So it talks about sustainability of agriculture. It talks about sort of agri-tech, so how can we utilise a lot of the sort of the innovative sectors to promote sustainability, and then obviously within sort of the investment sphere, so how do we make sure that investment within sort of projects, it doesn't have to be particularly environmental projects, do come from a sort of a clean source. So those are probably the three main ones, but there is a lot of appetite within Australia because it's playing catch up, and because of that sort of economic diversification factor, where Australia is a massive exporter of fossil fuels, and it is trying to get away from that. So renewables are probably the #1 priority within the sort of the Australian government mindset, and I know a lot of Australian businesses are looking to the UK for a lot of knowledge, talent, and sort of collaborative opportunities.
Thanks, Connor. And just out of interest, and Henrietta, you're across the board of the UK's trade deals in general for the Institute. How does that tally with the kind of environmental aspects of other trade deals the UK has signed?
This is, of course, a very interesting issue, and I think this agreement, especially, it can align well with the UK government's green trade agenda by promoting the sustainable practices, supporting renewable energy, promoting circular economy, and addressing climate change. And I think that's something that we are hoping to see in other agreements coming as well. As we know, the Australia and New Zealand agreements are some of the two first agreements to be signed after Brexit. So we don't really know what to expect yet, but it is definitely something that we are hoping to see in future UK trade agreements.
It's a really interesting area. So yeah, thank you both for answering Barry's question, Ben. I hope that was useful, Barry. I'm just going to share the results to that poll we just asked. And I don't think this is particularly surprising. So half of you say logistics and distance is the main challenge of doing trade with Australia for your business. And that's followed up by 26% on market knowledge, interestingly enough. 10% say tariffs, 7% market access. So I wonder if that's come down since the trade deal was agreed. We asked this poll last year, so I'll have a quick check to see if that has been a significant change because of the deal. And 7% of you have said other. We had a question which actually follows up really nicely from that poll. It's come in from Lucy. Lucy works for a SME with tight margins and little available cash flow for investing in the Australian market at the moment, particularly in terms of the logistical costs of sending goods there. What support is there for my business? Again, Connor, do you want to start on that question?
Yeah, more than happy to. So obviously, one of the tricky things about logistics, and obviously Australia is quite far away from the UK, is that a lot of the logistics companies are private enterprises, so there's not a lot the government can do in terms of stepping in. I know in terms of exporting to Australia, I know a lot of state governments have sort of incentives packages to promote their state within sort of an import market destination. So I know particularly here in WA, they've just launched, it's actually called the Launchpad, where they want to attract a lot of sort of imports from Europe, the UK and North America. And what they do is they provide sort of tax incentives and sort of funding grants for foreign companies that want to sort of set up shop in WA or have a base of operations. If it's simply exporting to Australia, I know the sort of Austrade, or the Australian Trade Commission, has a lot of support packages available in terms of sort of tax offsets in terms of if you do go through the traditional Australia Post way, there can be a lot of avenues that they promote in terms of reducing the cost of logistics. But the caveat of that is that Australia Post in general is quite pricey. So the cost that is coming down from that sort of threshold might be already what you're getting from traditional logistics companies such as DHL. So probably not the best answer, but we are expecting a lot of logistics costs here in Australia. When I checked a lot of the ports, they are expecting it to come down within the next 2 or 3 months. So hopefully by the time the deal comes into force, costs should be reduced about 30 to 45% of the sort of the peak.
Thank you, Connor. Well, I mean, the Institute's daily update has a quite regular feed of insights about kind of shipping costs. So we'll try to make sure that we're covering those kind of UK to Australia routes as part of that. Henriette, do you have anything to add to Connor's answer just in terms of the cash flow element for SMEs looking to export to Australia?
Sure. Here at IOE, we are very focused at helping especially SMEs with their export journey. So with regards to financial incentives, it is, as Connor said, it is sometimes a bit limited, but it is worth looking to the government for support. There is a range of other support channels that can be offered. It might not necessarily be financial incentives, but it can also be trade shows. It can be other supportive events or assets. It's also worth looking to trade associations because they can be a valuable source of support and advice for SMEs looking to enter the Australian market. Such organizations often have a very established network as well and can provide guidance on issues such as logistics and transportation. So that can be companies such as Austrade, as Connor mentioned, and us at IOE&IT as well. It's worth looking at logistics providers. They often specialize in supporting SMEs with limited budgets and resources. So these providers can also offer cost-effective shipping solutions, and they can help SMEs navigate the complexities of international shipping. E-commerce platforms is also a good option for SMEs with limited resources. They can be a very cost-effective way to enter the Australian market, and then you don't have the need for significant investments in logistics and infrastructure. As well, the last thing I want to mention is the partnerships and collaborations. So it's worth exploring partnerships and collaborations with other businesses in the UK or also already based in Australia. This can help also share the cost and resources and provide access to already established networks and supply chains.
Thank you both of you. Hope that's a helpful answer. We've had a load of questions come through about kind of proof of origin as a general topic. So, and basically how to make sure that you're declaring that you're using the terms of the trade deal. So, one kind of question which I think sums up nicely is from Ryan. How do we tell customs that we want to utilize the free trade agreement? Is it by issuing an origin statement like other UK free trade agreements? Connor, do you want to start on that one?
Yep, so upon sort of our discussions with Australian Border Force, they're taking a very lapsed sort of view of this. So it can be including sort of your rules of origin certificate, and then it's a self-certification process. So companies can just say, you know, your product comes from the UK. If you do sort of supply your rules of origin sort of criteria or breakdown, that assists. The caveat to that is that ABF will be providing sort of random checks on UK companies because they are seen as sort of a favoured nation status. So that's something to keep in mind. So if you are doing everything legitimately, then self-certification is the way to go. But having said that, a lot of companies are still promoting sort of their use of customs brokers. So that is sort of another avenue, but self-certification is sort of guaranteed within the FTA.
And in terms of that self-certification, Sylvia asked a question, is it known what form that will be? Would it be kind of on the invoice declaration, a certificate of origin, or, and she also asked, will there be a value threshold like with REX?
So I think Australian Border Force will establish their own, because I know they've done it with a couple of other free trade agreements. I know that it's not on the website as of yet. We are hoping that by sort of the 12th or the 13th of May that we should get something in, but I'm happy to disseminate that to sort of the IOE and everyone on this sort of webinar once that does come through, or I'm happy to provide a link.
Perfect. Thank you, Connor. That answers quite a lot of the questions. Actually, a lot of people asking about that, so that's great information. We've not talked so much in the Q&A yet about CPTPP. I think I've got the right number of P's there. A question which has come in from Susan is, will the Australia trade agreement tariffs and rules always be more beneficial to my company than the CPTPP rules, or does it change on a case-by-case basis? I have put all of these questions to Connor first. I don't know, Henriette, do you want to take that one first?
Sure, I'm happy to. So with any trade agreement, it's always on a case-by-case basis. So just because there now will be 2 trade agreements that covers the same market, it doesn't mean that one replaces the other. So the rules can vary on a case-by-case basis. The UK-Australia Free Trade Agreement and the CPTPP are both free trade agreements that aim to reduce barriers to trade and increase the economic cooperation between countries. But there are some differences in terms of the specific provisions and rules in each agreement. So the choice of which agreement to use will depend on the specific circumstances and needs of your company or the company in question. So factors that can influence this choice might include the type of goods or services being traded, and the size and the scale of the company, and the specific market conditions in each region. So I think companies should carefully evaluate the terms and benefits of both agreements, as well as any associated costs and risks in order to make an informed decision about which agreement is most advantageous for your specific business needs. Thanks.
Connor, anything to add to that from your side?
No, I would probably echo that. Obviously, say within the Australia Free Trade Agreement, if you're talking about, say, access to government procurement, that's only provided within the Australia FTA, and it's not provided within CPTPP. In terms of sort of taxes and tariffs, obviously, again, it's a case-by-case basis. So I would just have sort of an overarching look at both documents, and then see which one sticks out in terms of the particular sector or the issue that you're trying to solve.
Perfect. We've got time for a few more questions. Another question on CPTPP from Brett. Brett asks, actually, I should just say, for those of you who do not necessarily know, CPTPP stands for the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership. It's the big kind of Trans-Pacific Pact, which the UK has recently secured accession to. It's 11 nations now, 12 with the UK joining, and that includes Australia, but also New Zealand, countries like Japan, Vietnam, and I won't say too many more just in case I get anything wrong, but it's a very exciting pact that the UK is joining, and do visit the gov.uk or export.org.uk site for more information about it. But a question about that again from Brett, who says, could you say a little bit more about how accumulation rules in CPTPP could work if, for example, my business were to manufacture goods using parts from Australia, Vietnam, and Japan? Henrietta, do you want to start on that one?
Sure. So the specific rules around the accumulation in the CPTPP, it will depend on the specific product in question and the countries involved. Since we have a lot of countries involved in the CPTPP, the UK will now be the 12th agreement. It very much depends on which ones are involved, such as here mentioned Australia, Vietnam, and Japan. But generally, the CPTPP will allow for bilateral and or diagonal accumulation, which means that inputs from one or more member countries can be counted towards the rules of origin. But it's worth noting that using the accumulation rules can be complex, and it's important to understand the specific rules and the requirements in order to ensure that you are compliant with the rules. So this might require close collaboration with suppliers and partners in other countries, as well as careful documentation and record keeping to demonstrate compliance with the rules of origin. So my best advice would be reach out after this webinar, or when you have a question on which agreement benefits your business. Reach out to a trade association such as ourselves, reach out to the support available from government as well.
Thanks, Henrietta. It seems a complicated area, so I think that's a good way of answering that particular question. We'll do a couple of quick fire questions to finish off with. One come in from Sandra, who's asked just about actually the vaccine status is required. So what are the rules on vaccine status and entry for market visits? Do you have to be triple jabbed to enter Australia? Connor, what's the latest? Because I know Australia was a bit later coming out of the lockdowns than when we were over here. So what's the current situation?
Currently, right now, then there's no need to be vaccinated anymore. If you were to ask me about 6 months ago, it would be a state-by-state basis, but sort of the Commonwealth has stepped in and said we need a sort of a cohesive approach. So there's no requirements to be vaccinated anymore.
Good stuff. And we had a couple of questions in from Philip, just around what tariff reductions, or if any, have been applied for wines and spirits. I saw gin was 5%, I think, on one of the slides. But yeah, I mean, obviously, big fans of Australian wines, and hopefully English and Welsh wines are going to become more popular too in the coming years. So yeah, what's the situation with wines and spirits, Connor?
In terms of alcohol, so I know from a UK government perspective, alcohol was probably one of the biggest sort of priorities within the sort of the agri-food and drink sector. So we are looking at so Scotch, whiskey, wine, and gin. So I think they're all from between 5 and 10% through to 0%. So all sort of alcohols that are exporting from the UK to Australia will get 0% tariffs from entry into force.
Terrific stuff. I hope that's good news I've lost the name of the person who asked that question. That's a terrible sin as a host, but I hope that is good news for Philip. Fantastic. Right, well, I think we're starting to get towards 10:15. Let me just have a quick check to see if there's any other questions which we've not covered yet. Sorry, bear with me a second. There's a question about steel, actually, which might be worth putting to you. From Richard. Richard asks, you mentioned steel was not included in the free trade agreement. Does this include manufactured goods with steel? It's a slightly specific question, but is that one you can take on the call? Is that one best to do offline after?
Probably best offline, but in a general context, usually if it's manufactured with steel, then you should be in the clear, but it is a case-by-case basis. So we have a couple of businesses that I've chatted to do have a particular element within the steel, and they don't qualify, whereas others do. So I'm happy to take that one offline.
Perfect. And I did post the details of how to contact Connor in the chat. Just before we go, I'm going to launch one final poll. And this is just to gauge how confident you are that you have the knowledge and skills needed to benefit from the UK-Australia trade deal. And it's a very confident to not at all confident scale. As we are running that poll, I'd just like to thank Connor and Henrietta again for answering your questions there and for the presentations earlier as well. I hope everyone has found that useful. Please do get in touch sorry, I've gone ahead of my script. Quick reminder that we will be sending the recording of today's webinar over the next day or so. Please do get in touch if for any reason this email doesn't come through to your main inbox. Me, Henrietta, and Connor are going to be back again tomorrow morning for another webinar, this time on the UK's trade deal with New Zealand. And we're also going to be joined by Sharon Drew, the Director of Trade and Investment for the Department for Business and Trade's New Zealand office. So that's going to be hopefully a really useful session again, I'm sure. I posted the link to that webinar in the chat towards the start of the webinar. So you can either register through that link, or you can go to export.org.uk for more information about this particular webinar and all of our other upcoming webinars and activities. On the site, you can find out how to join as a member of the Institute and the educational and consultancy services we provide to businesses and individuals looking to thrive in international trade. But thank you everyone for joining us today. Thank you also for answering the polls. Really great to get that insight from you as ever. As you leave, please do let us know what you thought of today's webinar and any suggestions for topics in future for future events by completing the short exit survey. Just so that you know, here's how you responded to that last poll. So majority of you are feeling either quite or very confident. So 76% quite confident, 7% very confident. Again, it's a relatively new deal, so that's not too surprising that it's quite often very. But 15% not very confident, 2% not at all confident. Hopefully more webinars like these will help you to feel more confident. But from me, Connor and Henrietta, thanks for joining and have a great rest of the day. Bye everyone.